All right, this is our second review video for the first exam for Introduction to Philosophy. This is the second version of the cosmological argument, which we're calling the contingency cosmological argument. I started in class with this little thought experiment, asking you to imagine that you go on these walks in the afternoon, and one day, same route, everything has been exactly the same, except you turn the corner and there's a big glowing orb there in front of you. You definitely know it was not there yesterday. And I asked you guys what your reaction would be, and for the most part, we converged on the following reaction. Among other reactions, we all agreed we would ask ourselves, where in the world did this come from? What brought this to be here? And what it brought it to be at all? The argument from contingency for the existence of God is a cosmological argument that in a way tries to capture that reaction that you may have had to the existence of the hypothetical orb, and argues that if you had that reaction about the existence of the orb, you really should have that reaction, exactly the same reaction, about the existence of the universe as a whole. Indeed, the existence of any material thing whatsoever. The reason you had that reaction about the orb is that it's a contingent thing. It's a thing that exists but didn't have to. And that's our definition of a contingent being. A being that exists but possibly does not exist. So this is a being that, although it is, it didn't have to be. Had things gone differently, a contingent being would not have been. The universe as a whole, according to this argument, displays precisely the same contingency as the orb. Of course, other material things that make up the universe, trees and tables and chairs and animals and other human beings, these things are, for us, more familiar to the orb. But at bottom, they're just as contingent. And so to the extent that we have the reaction to the orb, that there has to be a cause, or there has to be something outside of this that explains it, we should have that same reaction about the universe, given its contingency. And the defender of the contingency cosmological argument thinks that that observation that the universe is contingent is the first step that we need to prove that there must be a creator outside the series of contingent things that is the universe. Now, that creator, they're going to argue, is a necessary being. And a necessary being for us is a being that exists and does not possibly not exist. Another way to put this is the idea of a necessary being is the idea of a being that is and couldn't have failed to be, no matter how things could possibly have gone differently in the universe. If there's a necessary being, the necessary being would have been. One thing to note here is that necessity is part of the classical conception of God. And this is part of why the defenders of the argument from contingency think that if they can prove that there is a necessary being that is the creator of all the contingent beings we see around us, they have gotten awfully close to proving that the God of classical theism exists. The other notion that we need to have in our back pockets to understand the argument from contingency is the notion of a dependent being. The notion of a dependent being is the idea of a being that is caused to exist by something outside of itself. This is roughly the idea of a being that has an efficient cause. The final piece that we need to understand before we can lay out the argument is the principle of sufficient reason, or PSR. Leibniz formulates the PSR differently in different places. And in your reading the William Rowe piece, he relies on a more unrestricted version of the PSR. I'm going to rely on a more narrow version of the principle of sufficient reason. Partly on some readings, Leibniz endorses the more narrow version. So that's part of the justification for the more narrow version of the PSR that we'll be running with. The other is that if you can get away in philosophy with defending a more narrow principle, then there's no reason to open yourself up to further objections by defending a much broader or more general principle. So here are a couple of quotes from Leibniz in which he, at different places in his work, lays out the principle of sufficient reason. He says, "No fact can hold or be real, and no proposition can be true unless there is a sufficient reason why it is so, and not otherwise." So there, in the not otherwise bit, you see him restricting the principle a little bit. His claim is that no proposition that can be otherwise is so unless there's a sufficient reason why it's so. The can be otherwise signals that what he's concerned with is contingent truths or contingent facts, or the way we're going to put it, contingent beings. Every contingent being has to have a reason or cause outside of it. Elsewhere, he says the fundamental principle of reasoning is that there is nothing without a reason, or to explain the matter more distinctly, that there is no truth for which a reason does not subsist. Here's the version of the principle of sufficient reason that we're going to be using as we develop this version of the cosmological argument. I'm going to call this the PSR. Every contingent being has a cause outside of itself. Now, note that we can shorten this version of the principle of sufficient reason just a bit to make it easier to say and write if you're writing this down, by swapping in the definition, or swapping out the definition of dependent being for the word dependent being. A dependent being is a being that has a cause outside of itself. So when the PSR says that every contingent being has a cause outside of itself, what it's saying is every contingent being is dependent. In other words, every single contingent being is also a dependent being. In class, we talked a little bit about why I think this principle is true. And I mentioned that there seems to be really strong inductive or probabilistic, or you might even say empirical support for the PSR. I mean, after all, every single being that is contingent that you and I have ever encountered also seems to have a cause outside of it. Both big and small, both in everyday life and in scientific inquiry, everything that we encounter that is contingent, which is just about everything, also is brought into existence by something else. That suggests that there's a kind of deep law of reality at work, according to which every single contingent being is dependent. Another way to think about it is that if something is, but didn't have to be, then that raises the question, well, why one rather than the other? And it doesn't seem like if a being is contingent, it could contain within itself the reason why it is rather than not. And so we have to look outside of the being, that is, to that on which it depends, for an explanation. Those are two different ways of motivating the PSR. Here is the contingency cosmological argument. The conclusion is this: therefore there is a necessary being. Remember, that's a being that exists and would have existed no matter what. The first premise of the argument is an either or. It says either every being is dependent or there's a necessary being. The second premise says not every being is dependent, from which it does validly follow that there is a necessary being. Our first premise lays out two options. Our second premise eliminates one of those two options. And the conclusion says, well, the remaining option is the one that's true. So either every being is dependent or there's at least one necessary being. It's not the case that every being's dependent, so I guess there must be a necessary being. This is valid. This is what's called a disjunctive syllogism, if you're interested, which is a valid argument form. And the question we need to now ask is it sound? Are its premises true? Well, why think that either every being is dependent or there's a necessary being? Note that if this premise said either every being is contingent or there's a necessary being, that would be true by definition. But we defined contingency and dependence differently. A dependent being is a being that has a cause outside of itself. And so the defender of the contingency argument does have to give us a defense of the claim that either every being is dependent or there's a necessary being. They can't just say, well, it's true by definition. Their defense of this first premise should start with precisely that trivial definitional truth, which is this: either every being is contingent or there's a necessary being. And that's trivial definitional truth that no one should reject given the way we define contingency and necessity. A contingent being is a being that exists and possibly does not exist, and a necessary being is just a being that exists and does not possibly not exist. So the first step here says those are the only two options. Either every single being is in the category of contingent, or there's at least one that isn't, in which case it's necessary by definition. The second step then links together contingency with dependence, and this is the principle of sufficient reason at work for the first time. The PSR says every contingent being is dependent. It follows from 1.1 and 1.2, therefore either every being is dependent or there's a necessary being. Let's talk about the second premise. Not every being is dependent. This is the more interesting of the two, and it's the one that takes a little bit longer for the theist to defend. Why think that it isn't the case that for every being it is dependent on some being outside of it? Why couldn't that be the way things are? And there's no being that isn't like that. Well, we're going to start with this notion of a collection of beings. Before we give the defense, we just need to give this definition. Let's let collection C be the complete collection of all contingent beings there are, ever were, or ever will be. It's really important that this is the complete collection. That is, any being that's contingent is in the collection. Okay? Now, we can start making some claims that will set us up to defend premise 2. Here's the first step or premise in our defense of premise 2. 2.1, collection C is contingent. Collection C is contingent. In class, we spent some time on this. What we saw was that the theist will typically note that by definition, every part of collection C is a contingent being, and so it seems that the whole is contingent. We had an interesting discussion about when an inference from parts to whole is justified and when it isn't. We noted that the theist should not say that every single whole that has a bunch of parts that have a property also has that very property. What we saw was it depends on the nature of the parts in the whole and depends on the nature of the property. However, I did suggest in class that I think contingency does move upwards from parts to whole. That is, when you have a collection of entirely contingent things, it seems that the whole collection also is contingent. So the theist, I think, has a plausible case to make that 2.1 is true. If you're, as we move through this, getting lost and you're like, what's collection C? I've lost sight of the big picture. Think of collection C as the universe. The claim here is that the universe as a whole, which contains all the little contingent things, is itself contingent. Although it is, it didn't have to be. The universe is, but it didn't have to be. Our second step is the second invocation of the principle of sufficient reason. Every contingent being is dependent. And then the third step looks like the PSR, but it's not equivalent to it. The third step is this: only contingent beings are dependent. So the third step says that if a being is not contingent, then it is also not dependent. Whereas the PSR says that every single being that is contingent is dependent. Let's make some inferences. So if we just focus on 2.1 and 2.2, 2.1 says collection C is contingent. 2.2 says that the PSR is true, so every contingent being is dependent, from which it follows that collection C is dependent, because C is contingent and every contingent being is dependent. Now, if we remind ourselves what does dependent mean, it means that there's some being outside that causes it to exist. So if collection C is dependent, it follows that there is some being, call it X, that's outside of C. Now, I'm just going to drop the language of causing. You could infer that too, but what we're trying to do is eventually get to the conclusion that not every being is dependent. And all we need for that is to note that a dependent being is one that is brought into existence by something else. So if a being is dependent, then there's at least one other thing. And that's what we care about. There's at least one thing outside of the collection of all contingent beings. What do we know then about X, our being that's outside of the collection? Well, it's not contingent. How do we know that? We know that because collection C is the complete collection of all contingent beings. So by definition, if a being isn't in the collection of all contingent things, then it's not contingent. If it were, it would be in the collection. Since it's not contingent. Now, if we look at 2.6, which says that there's a being that is not contingent, which is this being that's outside of C, and we combine 6 with 2.3 here, which says only contingent beings are dependent, it follows from 2.3 and 2.6 that there is a being, X, that being that's not contingent, also is not dependent. Because what 2.3 tells us is that if a being is not contingent, then it's not dependent either. We know that this being X that's outside of C isn't contingent, and so we know that that being is not dependent. Now, of course, if there's a being X that is not dependent, it follows that not every being is dependent. There's at least one that isn't. And that was precisely the premise we were trying to defend. 2.2, or CC2, the second premise of the contingency argument, says that not every being is dependent. And that just follows from 2.7. So what we've done here is using only 3 assumptions, one of which is the PSR, and the other of which is really defensible, 2.1. I think the third one also has a lot going for it, but that may be a place to push back. We then just cranked the logical wheel, made some valid inferences, and got down to the conclusion that premise 2 is true. Here is the completed contingency argument. We've defended both premises, and we saw that it's valid. So the question really is, if you want to reject the conclusion that there's a necessary being, you have to reject one or more of those premises. And if you do that, it has to be because you reject one of the steps in the defenses of those premises, because the premise is validly followed from the steps of those defenses. Now, I'm just going to run through some possible objections to the argument. And one thing you should remind yourself of as you evaluate these objections for yourself is ask yourself, which premise precisely is this an objection to? And if you can locate which premise it's an objection to, ask yourself, which step in the defense of that premise is this objection rejecting? If you can't nail that down, then that suggests that it may be based on a misunderstanding. Okay, so here are a couple of objections that I think are on the weaker side. The first is the infinite series objection, which, as we saw, was a problem for the first cause version of the argument. The infinite series objection says, hey, theist, defender of the cosmological argument, you're making this assumption that the series of dependent beings or efficient causes can't be infinitely long. You're making this assumption that there has to be a first. But I don't know why I should believe that. And until you give me good reason, I'm not convinced that there's a necessary being. Now, this objection is, although a decent objection to Aquinas, is not a good objection to this version of the contingency argument, of the cosmological argument. Why? Well, because this argument precisely does not anywhere assume that the series of contingent/dependent beings, that is C, has to be finite. Nowhere does the argument say that. If we look back at what collection C is, we'll see that collection C is the complete collection of all contingent beings. Now, are there finitely many or are there infinitely many? The theist says it doesn't matter one way or the other, because what does matter is that however many there are, whether they stretch backwards into the past ad infinitum or whether there's a first, what matters is that you can consider them as a whole, all of them together, and what you'll see is that the whole will itself be contingent, even if it has infinitely many parts. And if the whole is itself contingent, then according to the PSR, there must be something outside it that explains it. So one way to think about this is that the defender of the contingency argument says, okay, suppose you're right. atheist or agnostic, that for any being in the series, there's something before it that brings it into existence. I still want to know why there's anything at all as opposed to nothing. I want to know why there's any series. And that's a good question because the series as a whole is contingent. And so it demands explanation according to the PSR. Once they can get that off the ground and they don't have to rely on any claims about the finitude of the series, they're then off and running and they can crank the logical wheel and complete their defense of CC2. So this is really why this is not a good objection to this version of the argument, because the argument nowhere assumes that the series can't be infinitely long. Here's another objection that I think misses the mark. The objection is as follows. Listen, the principle of sufficient reason says that everything has a cause outside of itself. So what caused God? What is the being that God depends on? And one of the virtues of this argument is that unlike other versions of the cosmological argument, this argument has an answer to the what caused God objection built right into it. This objection misstates the principle of sufficient reason. The principle of sufficient reason does not say that everything has a cause outside of it. The principle of sufficient reason says every contingent being has a cause outside of it. And the conclusion of the argument is that there's a necessary being. And so the question of what caused God incorrectly assumes that necessary beings are also in the scope of the PSR, but they're not. And that's not an ad hoc exception that's being made. It's instead tied deeply to the nature of contingency and necessity. Contingent beings, as we discussed, are beings that exist but didn't have to. For that reason, their existence cries out for explanation. There's another option for a contingent being. It is, but it didn't have to be. So why is it? But if you have a necessary being, then it's a being that would have existed no matter what. So it doesn't make sense to ask, well, why is it rather than not? Because there was no rather than not. For this reason, the main answer to this is simply to clarify the PSR. In class, we talked about a more complicated additional response to this objection that involves the notion of a self-existent being. For the sake of leaving this video on the shorter side, I'm going to leave that aside. We called that in class that harder answer to this objection. What's most important to know is that the theist merely has to clarify what the PSR says in order to respond to that objection. A couple of stronger objections. I don't know if ultimately these succeed or not. I leave it to you to think about them. One is the gap problem. And we encountered the gap problem when we talked about Aquinas as well. I think most cosmological arguments face a gap problem. What is the gap? Well, the gap is between the stated conclusion of the argument on the one hand and the original goal of the theist, which was to argue that the God of classical theism exists, on the other. So the atheist or agnostic might listen to the contingency argument, not along the whole way, and even accept the conclusion and say, yeah, you got me, there's a necessary being. But why think that's God? I'm not convinced that that is the God of classical theism. In class, we noted some possible ways that the defender of this argument could try to close the gap, is the way we put it. Ideally, they'll want to draw on resources that are internal to the argument that they've already proven. Once they have to start saying things that are outside of the premises of their original argument, they then are making new arguments. And that is fine and potentially, arguably, what the theist is going to have to do. Cosmological arguments may have to be supplemented with further arguments. But the theist should get as far as they can closing the gap with just the resources of the original argument. A few things to note here. The theist can say we don't merely know that this is a necessary being. We also know that if this being exists, and you've agreed with me that my conclusion is true, we have also learned that it's the creator of everything else. And so for that reason, it has one of the defining properties of the God of classical theism. In addition to necessity, it also is the creator of all. We also know that it's outside the material world, because the material world is roughly collection C. And we know that this creator is outside that collection. So we have an immaterial being that is the creator of everything that had to exist, and also arguably is self-existent in the sense that because it's necessary, we also know that it doesn't depend for its existence on anything else. It's self-existent. And those are a number of other features of the God of classical theism. Now, is that enough to convince the atheist that this being is God? I don't know. And I think probably not. Partly because the God of classical theism is also, in addition to being creator, necessary, immaterial, and self-existent, supposed to be a person. It's supposed to be conscious. It's supposed to be something that feels and thinks and wants and believes. We haven't been given reason to think that this thing is a person. So that is an additional area where the theist probably will need to reach outside of the cosmological argument and maybe look at other arguments to try to close the gap further. Finally, I think the strongest possible objection to the argument is to deny that the PSR is true. Ideally, if you deny that the PSR is true, it would be because you have counterexamples to the PSR. It's not the only way of resisting it, but it's certainly the strongest way of resisting it. A counterexample to the principle of sufficient reason would be an example of a contingent being that's not dependent. This could be a contingent being that has no cause, or it could be a contingent being that in some sense is its own cause. If you could come up with a counterexample to the PSR, that would be a big deal. It also would mean that both defenses, that the defense of premise 1 and the defense of premise 2 both fail, because they both, as we saw at crucial junctures, assume the truth of the PSR. Without the PSR, those defenses fall apart. I'm not going to go into the details here. There's a lot of discussion in philosophy about whether the PSR is true. This particular version is harder to come up with counterexamples to. One possible counterexample might be human free decisions, if we are free, and furthermore, if our free decisions are uncaused. Those are two big ifs. But that is one conception of what free will would have to be if we had it. When we get to the unit on free will, we'll talk more about that. But the thought is, if that is what freedom is, then human free decisions are little events in the mind that are contingent because they could have happened differently or not at all, and that lack causes outside of themselves, or at least deterministic causes. There are other alleged counterexamples from quantum physics. I'm not super qualified to hold forth about that, but I invite you to consider any other possible counterexamples you might have to the PSR and think carefully through whether you really have an example of a being that's contingent and yet not dependent. That is our review of the contingency cosmological argument. See ya.